Okay, hi, I'm John Hutnick, and I'm going to talk today about social anthropology and tourism studies. This is a kind of a way of me doing a review of the course that we've done together and read a lot of different things, but all kind of around this one particular idea that I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to talk about it specifically in relation to tourism studies and to the pandemic, but also with a view to thinking about how we go forward to study. Okay, in other areas, perhaps this would be relevant too. So this is course 302113. It's changing for next year to 302118, and I put chapter 16 because it's one out of sequence, but yeah, it doesn't matter. The course name has changed too, but that will be the name going forward. And by the by, what I'm going to talk about is this article, though. Right, so this is an article. You see the title: "Study Tourism Means Going to Have a Look for Yourself." That's the slogan of the course. I must have said a dozen times. Co-research vulnerabilities and opportunities after the pandemic, and it's in the journal Tourism Recreation Research, which is a good journal, and this is a special issue put together by Keith Hollingshead and Shalini Singh. But Keith Hollingshead sadly passed away about a year ago. So the first writing of the article was done while Keith was around and he commented on it. But the second part was rewritten while I was doing this course, and it's now coming out as a special issue in about a month in honor of, or in memory of Keith Hollingshead, who influenced many people. Some of his work we read in the course, or some people at least read, and he's an important voice in was an important voice, remains an important voice in tourism studies and critical tourism studies. In that spirit, then, I thought I would talk about another critical voice in tourism studies, which is my teacher Malcolm Crick, who I get this term "going to have a look for yourself" from, and who controversially, provocatively and intentionally provocatively and with a sense of mischief, suggested that anthropologists and tourists were the same in about 1985, tracing the anthropological self, an article. It belonged to the kind of reflexive rethinking of what anthropologists do movement that was popular then, has been popular since. And Malcolm's work is was influential and roundly denounced, and I think you quite like that, and suggestive. So I want to think about that in relation to tourism. And I say at the beginning, tourism studies cannot rely upon studies of tourism alone, right, to cover its range. So I'm thinking about how anthropology at that time around Malcolm's article injected a kind of frisson of excitement, not exactly a renaissance, but a rethink, a reconstruction of some parts of tourism studies anyway, that seems now, maybe because of a certain inertia around market studies and market research, dominance of, needs a reboot. And in a way that seems really appropriate to me anyway, to rethink tourism and anthropology as kind of the question of study. What is it to study and who studies? So for me, this is a way of thinking about what it is that we do when we produce, or the question of who produces knowledge. Who does the study? And the argument underlying it, of course, is everyone. Everyone is a researcher. Students are researchers from day one. People in the tourism industry, whether they're tourists or hosts or service workers or whatever, also do forms of study. And the question is how that becomes knowledge, and who gets paid for that. Anyway, Malcolm Crick's glossed anthropology and tourism together provocatively. I think the summation was something like that anthropologists, yeah, they are interested in culture like tourists, but they stay a lot longer. The idea was 1 year in fieldwork, and they maybe get entrapped by a more sophisticated kind of tout or tour guide, and they go deep. Well, we can debate how deep they go, especially now because some forms of field work are quite short. No longer the year. Well, it's still a year in a tent for many, but some forms of anthropology include fly by night, parachute in to do a cultural, ethical impact survey type study, and can be as short as a few weeks. But generally, mostly the credential of having a PhD in anthropology means that you've still done field work in the now 100-year-old traditional sense, the Malinowski style, which we talked about in the course a lot, and we questioned and challenged, and yet also saw its benefits and limits. Okay, so there's that. And this then, in the context of well, it's a contribution of knowledge to human togetherness and so on, but it's also a privilege. And in the context of the pandemic and COVID-19 and lockdown and the end of international travel, that privilege was kind of curtailed for many. In a way, it became a lot more difficult to do field work or to do tourism, for that matter, with the same cause. And going to have a look for yourself became not impossible, but more difficult and less privileged. Okay, so there's this. And then I guess what I'm thinking is that then some discussion towards the end, I guess, of the pandemic, or as the pandemic was winding up, or at least discussion of getting back to, reopening the economy and rebooting the tourism sector and so on, was underway. There was some commentary on what an opportunity it is to reevaluate. So this is partly the reevaluation as well, but mainly it's around the question of Rick's credo of going to have a look for yourself, tourism, and the world anticipating never being the same again after the pandemic, the ongoing COVID-19 situation, living with that, and thinking about how that affected not just tourism, but other adjacent industries quite severely. Let's get into it. So Crick's credo of going to have a look for yourself, said that in lectures. So it's not there in his, I think it's not there in his book, Resplendent Sights, Discordant Voices, Sri Lankans and International Tourism, which is his book based on 7 months of field work, but a lot more reflection. 7 months in Kandy in Sri Lanka, hanging out in guest houses, not going out that much late at night. I mean, it's not exactly a social being, so it was always the case that fieldwork was going to be difficult for him. This came out in '93, I think. It's a great book, was somewhat overlooked. It's perhaps a bit expensive. Anyway, yeah, it was his big book, finally. Another one he did on semantic anthropology was more theoretical. He was a student of Edward Ardner, and quite important. Worked a lot with John Perry, sorry, and has quite a number of other essays that can be found. No pictures of him on the internet that I could find. There might be some. By the by, it's interesting. Now, thinking about going to have a look for yourself, at the same time, the opportunity was offered to have a look at what tourism was, because tourism collapsed. We could suddenly take stock. Okay, what was it then? And now it's gone. Well, international tourism collapsed, right? Because that was the whole thing about the pandemic, right? Wasn't it? That the virus was spread by travel. If you remember in Vietnam, where we are, the first big controversy around the pandemic was an airline pilot that went clubbing and infected some people through the club and so on. So there was quite some issue, and international travel was not directly because of that pilot, but was curtailed, and went from about 18 million a year arrivals to Vietnam to down to just a few thousands. And that was a significant effect on the travel economy. Domestic travel was halted a bit, not as much. There was lockdown periods where there could be no travel. But there was also the very interesting attempt to boost domestic travel to make up the numbers. And the great slogan, Nuoi Viet Đi Du Lịch Vietnam. Vietnamese will go and visit Vietnam. I think that was a brilliant slogan. And in fact, yes, they did. But the economic benefit or the economic contribution to the economy of domestic tourism is not as large as that of international tourism. For every from every dollar spent or earned or deployed in domestic tourism, one international tourist spends 10 times that amount. So the income brought into the country, obviously, is much more. The discussion of this opportunity, surprise opportunity of the stop, shouldn't be just in tourism, because other industries stopped as well. Just looking out onto the city, it was very clear. The air was very clear. The air was clearer. There wasn't any industry. Of course, that hurt a lot of people as well, but it also had some interesting topics for discussion. But this idea of using that period as a kind of special experiment. Here's a period where there was no tourism. So what is the impact of the economy? What's its impact on the economy been? Really became a discussion towards the end of the suspension. Actually, when people started to talk about restarting the economy, then what we learned from that period of nearly 2 years of suspension became a topic. And that was not just a topic in tourism. Of course, a lot of people lost their jobs in tourism straight away. I know many went to a eco lodge near Canto, for example, during the pandemic, and of the 42 people that worked there, only 2 had kept their jobs. A lot of them were precarious workers on short-term or uncontracted, and they had to go and find work elsewhere. A lot of them became shippers from Grab and found other work. Not all, of course, but there were new jobs that emerged because of the pandemic. But not just in tourism, the building trades which a lot of hotels are built as a consequence of the expansion of tourism over the last decade or so. That also came to a halt. And so restarting the economy was recognizing that. There are other sectors. Like tourism isn't only an economy for tourism, it's also in services, and it's also in the building trades. Think of Novaland and all of that, those big companies who are now in trouble. Or think of service workers or cultural sector, nightclubs and street cafes, street food, the food festivals, the flower festivals, you name it, river cruises and so on and so forth. And so it's not just in one sector. And so the economy, recovery of the economy was a lot was invested in rebooting, restarting tourism. But at the same time, that was when tourism studies people started to talk about having this opportunity to learn something. Here we look at the numbers a bit. You see, we only have numbers from the General Statistics Office, like formal numbers, for up to the preliminary numbers for 2021. You see the collapse. We've got 18 million in 2019. 3 million, nearly 4 million in 2020. Remember, January and part of February was still up at the couple of million per month mark before COVID came. And then early figures for 2021, I don't know that they're the complete figures for 2021, were just at 157,000. A massive collapse in international travels. Domestic travel was affected differently. In fact, domestic travel has gone up. I do have a statistic for more recent stuff on foreign travel. Right, this is foreigners arriving in foreign international arrivals. I don't like the word foreigners. International arrivals in Vietnam in January, just for 1 month, is up to, in 2023, now 800.1 plus 65 and 5 by road and maritime. So nearly 1 million for the month. So that's going to be, work it out, about 12 million for the year, or probably a bit of an increase. Forget about see where it says 46.1 times higher. Well, of course, that's because it's higher than just 157,000 or whatever it was in 2022. I don't have that number. But what's really interesting here, if even 12 million is not 18 million, and what in January doesn't show there in the statistics because it's by territory, thousands of arrivals at the bottom, is the absence of Russian and Chinese tourists, which is a large portion of the original 2019 number of 18 million. And Chinese weren't coming because they were still in lockdown until January, and Russian arrivals, Russian tourism is probably affected by both COVID and the Ukraine war. But still, we're looking at substantial revival, but a slow recovery, which is something that's interesting. But I wanted to get onto this idea that the suspension of tourism had affected lots of workers, lost their job, precarious workers especially, had to rethink, well, what are they going to do? They're trained workers as well, a lot of them, especially foreign tourism, English speaking or able to speak English, and had to rethink of what they were going to do. Not all of them, but the front of house staff, at least. And the recovery is slow, so not everyone has been rehired, and the effect on other sectors is important. But this was thought of by tourism studies people as, an amazing kind of thought experiment. COVID-19 closed travel, so that gives us a chance to study the situation. And it does make things look a bit different. The photograph you're looking at is one I've taken of one of these developments, because I was looking at, for another paper, looking at the building activity, the building industry around the construction of new hotels, all up the Ho Tram Strip on the southern coast of Vietnam, right? Hundreds of new places being built, and there were lots and lots of workers that stopped work during the lockdown, and lots of temporary, for every hotel complex, very large hotels are being built, and apartments. There's of course a lot of workers, and those workers need to be fed, so a lot of cafes, roadside cafes, compound places and so on spring up alongside the highway. They're running up there. But because it's largely what's called casino tourism, building casinos for the I guess largely Chinese market, or at least the Asian market, those tourists were not arriving as yet. And as you see, here's a beach completely empty on the Ho Tram Strip. Actually, there's one person in it. If you have a look, there's nice beach furniture, but there's one small guy there who's taking a photograph of me taking the photograph. A little more textual echo. He's so bored that even someone taking a snap with just a camera would be snapped. What was I doing? Now, this is outside some pretty cheesy, colorful casino hotel type places that hopefully with the reopening of Chinese tourism are now getting some customers, but they were massively affected. So it's an interesting environmental, ecological, and economic circumstance that needs to be studied. But yeah, the pandemic changed much, so there's lots of different things that can be studied, and what it is that tourism studies scholars study and investigate is broad, of course, as ever. So we think about what is it that we might want to be, who are we, and what it is that we might want to study. That's a factor. Okay. I'll just mention in passing the red books here are travel guides from the 18th century, 19th century, sorry, from the Grand Tour, 19th and early 20th century. Now, Malcolm Crick, back in 85, pointed out that the subject position of the host, guest, and interpreter, or in his terms, the tourist, the tout, and the hippie ethnographer were interchangeable. And as I said, he meant this provocatively and intentionally to wind people up, but also very seriously. And I think we should take him seriously. At least his key point, anthropologists were sort of like tourists, as the consensus became. The more interesting effort maybe is to turn this around, sort of like tourists. They're just a little bit allegedly working at a deeper level. I don't know whether that's true. Is exoticism still exoticism because you're well informed and have spent a lot more time getting into the ancient myths, or is that like even more exoticizing? But anyway, the interesting fold, or a possible fold, a potential new version of this, is to make the case for not tourists to be more like anthropologists, not anthropologists to be recognized that they're like tourists, but for tourists to be construed as anthropologists. Now, there's a bit of a hard ask in Vietnam, where anthropology is, I think, less geared to experimental and reflexive anthropology, and fair enough too, perhaps because it's somewhat indulgent, that whole writing culture debate. But a lot of tourism studies is really, I think, in need of some ludic, provocative thought, because it tends a lot towards market research. And while that's fine, it can't be the only thing. So recognizing that the tourism industry affects other sectors, that there's a lot of different topics and themes, and that there are things missing that anthropology can bring into tourism studies, is the basis for calling for a new rethink of how we study. How do we study? And that would be a reboot of anthropology and tourism and so on. All right, to reconfigure tourism study is a bit of a stretch. Here's a copy of Malcolm's Semantic Anthropology book. The main idea here, though, is that researchers involved in any project or study those researchers should be the ones who are the researchers should be those that are best placed to have insights into what's going on in any situation through time spent in that situation. And that means that tourists, and in fact hosts and guest service providers and people who work in the adjacent industries are directly involved in that situation, so they should be the researchers. And of course, this is a little bit of a stretch because they haven't done their PhDs, they haven't done that training of 1 year of fieldwork, and the university accreditation that is all-powerful would have to be broken down. And there are, of course, strong interests and people who would object to that. Yet, tourists already do study. They do their homework. They do so in choosing a holiday destination, deciding among the different options, style of tourism, budgets, locations, and they read the brochures and they work out their plans. And yeah, sure, their efforts are constrained by various factors. limited information. The brochure focuses on lovely pictures of beaches and temples that are never as beautiful in real life, and the sky is never as blue, that kind of thing. And you really want evaluations of quality of service and they have to rely on what the heritage museums present as heritage, rather than what getting in and seeing where the dusty parts of the museum are. And, the initiative maybe is what you don't have time for when you just want a holiday. So thinking about whether tourists could be researchers is more difficult. And of course, hosts and service providers, they're busy already providing these services and holidays. They can't be researchers. But then if they were paid to have the privilege like a researcher has of doing study, things might be different. I don't know. It's a suggestion here. So if tourism were reconfigured as studies, we think about how we would scale up from the old study tour. Now, those red books I showed you, Baedeker guidebooks, they hark back from the old continental Europe grand tour, which was part of the education of British aristocratic gentlemen and women with chaperones a bit later, and in the late 19th century, going to Europe to see the Sistine Chapel and the Vatican and become finished, educated, sophisticated young men, bourgeois completely, but so it goes. This history of study tours would be something to write about. People have written about. Reaches right up through the American Peace Corps with JFK, John F. Kennedy in America, and subsequently through Rotary clubs and charity NGOs, development groups, universities. People lead study tours all over. Leftist political groups did solidarity study tours to the Soviet Union or to Cuba, still goes on, no doubt to Vietnam. And it's a significant, not a huge part of international travel, but a part of solidarity study tours is a part of travel. And so also this ethos of project-based tourism. And I'll be critical of this, of people going to do good works, because volunteer tourism, digging wells in the desert for those that haven't got water is kind of indulgent in the sense of providing people with good sanitation and machinery that can dig wells for them might be better than having someone go there and be able to say, well, I went and did digging wells. The idea of the gift, right? That a gift in anthropology, we think a gift is never really just a gift. It's always a counter gift. And the giver also gets as much back, even if it's anonymous. You get, self-fulfillment or feeling of, I'm a good person, I'm a giver of gifts, right? And charity work is similar to that. And development work as well. I mean, if development work and aid really was going to level up and pay reparations, there wouldn't be these inequalities. Word would have got round. But anyway, it is the case that there's a tradition of study tours. It's a substantial segment, small, but substantial segment of tourism. And scaling it up is something I'd like to think about, since we had the opportunity of looking at tourism. And there are domestic, in every country, there are domestic versions of that as well, where people do contribution, putting back to the community, or in Vietnam, you have Green Summer, all students will do this, or the 3T program. Or these are increasingly popular, but not enough. The point is they can be scaled up. So imagine, for a minute, tourism and anthropology reconfigured as study tours. Perhaps there are already this happening with American tourists who do Agent Orange and dioxin cleanup. There's parts in the Delta of canal dredging where people join that. There's environmental homestays where people work in orchards and so on. green some already mentioned. We can consider how solidarity tourism might be grounds for a greater kind of conviviality or greater engagement. And sure, it's a function of privilege that allows charity tourism, the tourist intent on doing something, anything towards justice. There are a range of choices that follow from that. So while often charity and development work has been critiqued as self-serving, the advantage that accrues through privilege could be perhaps be redistributed. And where actions could be taken in solidarity that mainstream, give publicity to environmental issues or other issues, especially locally led causes, that there might be some contribution. There are possibilities, at least, not easily worked through, but possibilities for rethinking and indeed, after the pandemic, rebooting tourism. Think about the Mekong Delta in Vietnam as a space of solidarity for tourism in the context of the Mekong Delta Plan, for example, right? Endlessly, we hear stories about, from the UN numbers and figures, projections of the sea rising 400,000 meters, or there are droughts, or there are dams upriver, and so on. There are issues, and there is a plan run by the government, and people could also educate themselves about this and become involved in something to do with that Mekong development plan and the many aspects to it. It's very comprehensive. A vision, new opportunity, new values. It's not just rhetoric. It's also significant programs. There's a shift from a full rice economy to a mixed economy with brackish water, but of course not everyone can afford the startup costs of prawn farming, for example. So there are ways that reparation or investments could focus on that. You know, this hydraulic scene of the Delta is a basis for exploring, I think, how tourism, participatory tourism and study tours and so on could really rethink what solidarity, collaborative tourism, equity-focused, the idea of participatory research as well, right? Participatory methods is discussed in academia. It could be the lever that opens up tourism studies for justice, because participatory research doesn't mean doing research where you interview participants in tourism. It could also mean that that people participate in the research by being the researchers, not just being the subjects researched. And that's what participatory methods would be. And it would be those who participate in tourism. Of course, those who participate in providing tourism services are doing a job, and they, of course, don't have time and the privilege of credentials of a degree or a salary to be researchers. So there might be some institutional things to think through here that are big, and credentials and who gets to do research is the issue. Who gets to do research, if not the people who know what's going on in a particular situation? And we need to find ways to institutionally fold them in, recognize them, pay them, accredit them, and involve them in the production of knowledge about their situation. I mean, rather than having people parachute in and produce knowledge that serves themselves, and they get to write papers about it in journals like Tourism Recreation Research. Even though international arrivals bring in 10 times the revenue and also 10 times the visibility, perhaps, of domestic research. Yeah. Anyway, there's prospects for reconfiguring tourism as an expanded idea of study. I get this idea, this notion of study from Fred Moten and Stefano Hani's Undercommons book, but it's expanding this idea of the educational study tour to something much bigger. Of course, educational study tours could focus on many topics. Pollution been one noted by local communities as a factor, and there's been some studies of of that on farming or the effects on marine environment, on the delta, on mangrove, pollution and loss of habitat, the effect of toxins, pollutions from resorts could be a topic of study, concern to residents, local residents, and so on. There are quotes on this. Got this one from Dan et al. It's from Pan Saito Din Win Ta and Tieshi, 2004. It's a coastal problems such as floods, erosion, sedimentation, and saltwater intrusion, environmental pollution from, for example, oil, organic matter, pesticide residues, and also dioxin, and to varying degrees, heavy metals, and the degradation of ecosystems with accompanying decreases in biodiversity and fishery production are issues to explore. I mean, also the representation of these areas. You no doubt guessed from the photograph that this is Pandora, the mangrove swamps of it. The whole of that film, The Way of Water, was a commentary on Vietnam in the same way that the first issue was, the first version of, first Avatar was about Bougainville, somehow mining and environment. It's so, there's so much. Look at, oh, this is out of order. This is Green Summer. I think this is the Department of University of Psychology. I don't know why it's out of order, but Green Summer is another of the issues and topics. Yeah, I wanted to get to this photo here. Is Scully from Avatar. Basically, it's a quotation of the Apocalypse Now Vietnam War film poster, main poster, where Willard is about to kill the rogue Colonel Kurtz. Anyway, maybe it's naive to think tourists will want to study, right? Or tourist providers will want to study, or that hosts will want to have tourists interfering by producing knowledge about. But it's just simply not possible to think that all tourists, all tourist providers want to follow the same track. And while not all are suited to self-sacrificing honest work, in disregard of ego and so on, and tanning, there are some who might want to do that. And in fact, they're being encouraged with the structure of these. Now the travel guides have moved online, and these apps like TripAdvisor are using knowledge produced by the participants to fill their content, although it's superficial. The thing is to make this deeper. Rather than just 4 stars and a little quote about whether or not the service was good, really do some of the research into the Delta plan or the effects of dioxin on the sands and the Ho Chi Minh Strip or what have you. Expand that, since the people who are doing the activity, providers and tourists, consumers and housing, building workforce and catering and all those other adjacent sectors, health and so on, are the ones who know. And so they should be the ones producing the knowledge. So these are not unprecedented suggestions. This kind of co-research has a background and established projects that work, and even within tourism, continuity and there's credibility. And all right, maybe terms like creative tourism or co-research are a little bit cheesy, but you know, these code words do signify something deeper and worth thinking more critically about. Sustainable small-scale tourism, always on a small scale, provides a genuine visitor. What is a genuine visitor experience? Immersion in local. Well, what is it? Isn't that what anthropologists do with the learning and creative? How can that be generalizable to everyone? Strikes me as something worth thinking about. Though it's not like mass tourism can suddenly be replaced by some kind of evangelical global walking culture. The walking study tours are catching on. Nearly every city has walking tours. I've done them in Ho Chi Minh City as well. Actually, a guest of our conference at TDTU in 2019, Stephen Muki and Jennifer Eady have a really great paper on Aboriginal heritage walking tours in Australia. And I've got a couple of pictures from them. We go on this fantastic environment. I mean, doesn't give you a clue of actually how grand this is in Western Australia. It's not just climbing over rocks, it's learning about culture and okay, it's something for the tourists. They get a lot out of it themselves, but they also bring their economic benefits to the providers, and they learn something about country, and they're starting at least the process of breaking down the ignorance about Aboriginal culture and its significance, and the racism of Australia by learning, study tours, heritage walking trails that are full of educational knowledge and content, knowledge about country. The way in which they talk about country as knowledge is, there's something to be learned there. And that's another big story for future consideration. So going to have a look for yourself, that's Malcolm Quick's slogan, and I think it really works. If we don't do this, tourism studies will tend more and more towards market research, and anthropology towards elite but online voyeurism about exotica. And we should instead recruit those who've been impacted and infected by the ongoing crisis. There's always a crisis, right? To come into both anthropology and to tourism studies and bring their knowledge and become the researchers. And we have to find ways for the institution to adapt and learn to operationalize the concept of everyone as a researcher, every student a researcher, every student. It's an old slogan, goes back to Ho Chi Minh, but yeah. So I'm hoping tourism studies can unravel somewhat and become study and be more focused and together and foster a mode of collective writing, everyone producing knowledge that's reflexive, and dialectical and collaborative, and inspirational. Those seeking inspiration for renewed tourism studies can find it beyond the distanced observational participation of the pandemic period in Vietnam and promote a utopian future of everyone, everywhere, studying everything all the time. Okay, that's a bit too much, isn't it? But yeah, that's what going to have a look for yourself when you're thinking critically and suspiciously and excitedly and with a frisson of provocation and curiosity could be. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop presenting and have a pause. Thank you. And stop it. Manage recording. Stop recording. Okay.